Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Literature Channel. And I'm Tim Wilson. This is the fourth of a series of lectures on Coriolanus. I'd like to wrap it up today and hopefully talk a bit about some concluding thoughts on the play. So far we've been talking about the historical context. We've been talking about history in the sense that Shakespeare's looking to the past. He's looking to the past. He's looking to the Roman past to try to dig up, let's say, lessons learned about their highest form of government, republicanism, and whether or not that could be applied to the Jacobean context of his day. So we've talked a bit about that and about varied interpretations of what he wanted his Jacobean audience to take away from that comparison, all the way from supporting popular revolt, such as the Midland Revolt against aristocratic monarchical rule, to a support for on the other hand, people who say that Shakespeare supports a status quo of a monarchical rule, hierarchical rule in England. I would say I would land somewhere in the middle, and that there are things we can learn from the Republican form of government in terms of the participation of various elements of the society, and that Shakespeare's day could take away from that learning from the Romans. So in order to get through that, we wanted to talk a bit about what is republicanism in its Roman form, what it might have meant for Shakespeare, and definitely um, we see in the play that Shakespeare doesn't want us to just take this kind of form of government for granted. I think, if anything, the thrust of the play is a critique of the ideals of classical republicanism in terms of the virtue it commands from the citizens we see, rather than in the play, rather than virtuous citizens who want to contribute to a common good, which is the assumption of classical republicanism. We have characters and classes in conflict who are all looking out for their own self-interest. So there's a certain lack of civic virtue that is the foundation of classical republicanism, at least. So we want to have that in the background. And we talked in the last lecture about how Coriolanus also shows us, both the play and the character, what's lacking if we don't respect the power of words as much as actions. So political rhetoric is absolutely crucial. The ability to sway others is absolutely crucial in a Republican form of government where we have the participation of all, so that all can be directed to a common end. We see rhetoric breaking down in this play. Coriolanus absolutely does not uh, it all invest himself in trying to sway the people, and this becomes the source of his banishment. He favors actions over words to an extreme in the play, and this also leads to his tragedy to some extent. So at this point, I'd also like to turn to this theme of the body politic in the play, keeping in mind all what we've said about the limits of the Republican form of government in Shakespeare's Coriolanus. So he doesn't approach these questions, I want to say, in the manner of a philosophical treatise. He wants to bring the universal messages of political philosophy forth into in an image or individual characters. And we see in the image of the body politic a great example of what he's able to do. So the image of the body politic was obviously the fable of the belly that Menenius tells in the first scene. And that image of the body politic has a long history from Plato's Republic, Aristotle, John of Salisbury in the Middle Ages, and then Hobbes after Shakespeare. In Shakespeare's play, we've already had a chance to indicate, there's an absence of the head, so to speak. So in the fable of the belly, we have parts of the body without the head. We have this theme of the absence of Lycurguses that we talked about in a previous lecture. So if we remind ourselves of the three parts of soul and how they're attached generally or localized in different parts of the body, we have the plebeians representing the appetites or eros, and we have the patricians representing the spiritedness of thumos and aligned with the warrior class of Plato's Republic. However, there's no representative of the rational faculty aligned with the wise or philosophic rulers in this play. There's no head as I said, making decisions in Menenius's Fable of the Belly. We have the Senate, curiously, who should be it should be to some extent aligned with that, are curiously linked to the belly, generally in the classical tradition associated with eros or the appetites. Similarly, this kind of the image of the body of the state comes up in several other instances. I won't go through them all, but it is, for instance, the people feel that Coriolanus is merely a disease that can be excised, and for the nobles, on the other hand, Coriolanus is an essential element, like an arm or a limb that is flawed but needs to be healed, and it would be fatal for Rome to get rid of the limb. So the body and the images around it also implicate, let's say, how they think about the whole. Let's say the body is the whole, and parts belong to the whole. Now, there's essential parts and some that are like a disease that can be eliminated and gotten rid of. And so too, when we have a society, a state, there are essential elements, citizens that are participants, parts of the whole. And depending on the perspective in this conflict of the classes, they can think of the other elements as not necessarily as essential. And coming back to this theme of the the clash of the classes, there is obviously the Midland Revolt is in the background, and in the background is also the actual revolt of the plebeians at the time of Coriolanus, the historical Coriolanus. And to what extent does Shakespeare want us to sympathize with them? He does change several details from Plutarch's. To some extent, we're meant to sympathize with them. In this speech, I didn't go for it go through it in the last slide. They do make a case that they do need food, and it's not right that they don't have it. But he also depicts them as cowards, whereas in Plutarch, they fought nobly in the Sabine Wars. And so for this reason, Coriolanus, the fact that they're depicted as cowardly in Shakespeare, disdains them because of their cowardliness. He says, what would you have, you curs, that like nor peace nor war? The one affrights you, the other makes you proud. He that thrusts to you where he should find you lions finds you hares. Where foxes, geese, you are no sure no than is the coal of fire upon the ice, or hailstone in the sun. So for him, they don't deserve, free corn. They don't because they don't truly belong to that whole. If they haven't fought for the body politic, if they are not an essential element of that whole, then they don't uh, need, let's say, deserve the spoils, so to speak. And the plebeians admit themselves that they deserve to be treated as a fickle mob, as the many-headed multitude. So Shakespeare doesn't portray the plebeians fully sympathetically, I would say. Um, I would say the conflict between the classes is and the disintegration of the body politic is also manifest in the generally throughout the play in this conflict between public and private interests. So after Coriolanus is banished, we have Sicinius, one of the tribunes, describe this idyllic portrait of Roman tradesmen singing while they work. He says, Here do we make his friends blush that the world goes well, who rather had, though they themselves did suffer by it, behold the sensuous numbers pestering the streets, than see our tradesmen singing in their shops and going about their functions friendly. So we must keep this in mind that he's describing this after we've seen a scene where Coriolanus and Aufidius have made a pact to destroy Rome. So they are, let's say, whiling away, enjoying their trades, enjoying their free time, their private interests, but uh, let's say oblivious to the danger that that puts the Republic in. And I think Cantor puts this well. This is to quote Paul Cantor: "The banishment of Coriolanus has served the private interest of most people in the city, making life easier for all but his family and close friends. But at the same time, it has seriously hurt the public interest. For although the citizens are happy, the city itself is in mortal danger." So Coriolanus is absolutely necessary for the security of Rome, for the public interest. If you are interested, if your main, let's say, directionality is the public interest of Rome, it's in your interest to have a Coriolanus. However, if your interests are private and you just want to kind of make money and go about your trades, then you're glad that he's gone, because he had called on you to fight in wars and called you cowardly and denigrated the people. So, especially in times of war, private interests must be sacrificed for the common good. And as the first and third serving men note in Act 4, Scene 5, the previous scene, peace makes men hate one another because they then less need one another. So appealing to eros or private appetites will not motivate citizens to risk their lives in battle. Okay, that's a very important point. So Coriolanus appeals to a higher spirited thematic character of the, and tries to instill it in them, because I think he finds it lacking in these characters, in the plebeians, in the foot soldiers of his army. He doesn't appeal to their private interests. He appeals to a higher thematic impulse, honor, in the first scenes in the war against the Volscians. So I think what this all points to is what I would call the tragedy of the political, or the tragedy of the city, or let's say the tragedy of the common good. Okay. We have a whole, the political whole, a common good, a common whole, but we are separated into individual parts that can't see themselves in that common whole. Okay. And thus is the tragedy, so to speak. In our modern liberal republics, the tragedy of the commons is a term to describe the fact that individual ends are pursued with no higher end, and will ignore common interests, such as, littering in a public park or that type of thing, or kind of more fundamentally climate change, these types of things. Who's going to sacrifice private interests for that kind of common good? For Shakespeare, this happens, he's pointing out, even in the small community of Republican Rome, as opposed to our larger modern liberal republics. Even in the small community of Republican Rome, which according to classical republicanism, if you have a small city like Rome was at this time, that's how republics can thrive. They can see each other. They're basically the same type of people. They can identify with one another in common ends. But even here, we see an infinite variety of people, diverse ends, and they cannot align their common interests. Um, I think we see this too in several ways the throughout the play, in that, for instance, uh, for Coriolanus, the Senate has wrongly given Hydra here to choose an officer. The beast with many heads butts me away. So in Coriolanus's mind, he sees this in the Rome of his day. He sees that there are many heads, many different parts with many different directions. And um, the community seems to ignore the fact that the political life is a compound made of citizens as parts that participate in this whole, and they can't see that participation. Um, I think another way of seeing this, let's say the conflict between the public and the private is this dominance of the private sphere. Okay, so the private sphere ultimately trumps the public interest in the play. So um, of the scenes in the play, if you count the number of scenes, the absolute central scene, the 15th of 29 scenes, is Act 3, Scene 2. It's a central scene where Volumnia is trying to persuade Coriolanus to let's say sway the people. We have similar scenes in 1-3 and 5-3. Private scenes with Virgilia, with Volumnia, with the family in a private setting within a play that is largely, except those scenes, in a public context. Those scenes end up being the ones that are pivotal. So 3-2 is a pivotal scene where he decides too late to try to sway the people. Then 5-3 is the kind of the climax of the play where he's swayed by Volumnia not to attack Rome, and then that leads to his death, but it saves Rome. Um, and in this play that is so focused on the public sphere, what is interesting is that Shakespeare takes these moments of the private, the family, as the critical, actual moving mechanism of political life. Um, so we have a whole that is the community. The question is, who are the parts? Who are the citizens that belong to the whole? So depending on who you are, you might consider it differently. Um, for the people, Sicilia asks, "What is the city but the people?" And all the citizens echo their agreement. For Coriolanus, however, the term Roman is reserved for those who display the highest virtues, those of a warrior. He says, "I would they were barbarians as they are, though in Rome littered, not Romans as they are not, though calved in the porch of the Capitol." So for him, they're just animals, like animals who they were born in Rome. That doesn't make them citizens. They're like animals, and they're only citizens in as much as they participate in this higher warrior virtue. Um, I'll just and some more. I'll just refer to these quotes where he expands on this sentiment and sees them as animals, not citizens. So there's this question of trying to get outside the city, transcend the city. If we have a tragedy of the political, our highest aspirations, our highest form of longing is to belong to a whole of the cosmos, but maybe that's not accessible to us. So maybe we need to find a community or a whole within a smaller, a belonging within a smaller whole of the city. Um, and for Coriolanus, he cannot do that. And the question is, can you transcend the city? Can you philosophically transcend the city to a higher form of self actualization? And when he's banished, he thinks he can stand independently of the city. He banishes them back. He turns and his back on them to find a world elsewhere. But his tragedy and kind of the tragedy of the political is that there's an inability to fully transcend the political. He he tries to find a world elsewhere, but our next scene with him is in yet another city. Um, and Aristotle, says, because he finds that the city is prior to the household or each of us as individuals. Anyone who tries to stand outside the city is either a beast or a god, he says in the Politics. And then Nietzsche would later say that he left out the third case, which is both the philosopher. So Coriolanus is portrayed as both a beast and a god, but certainly not the third case philosopher. There's a number of instances where he's shown to be acting like a god. There's many instances where he's compared to a beast in his savage nature. But in no sense is he a philosopher who can transcend and question the political and find a higher wisdom. Um, and and partly it's because he's being able to participate in the city means it's contingent upon speech. So for Aristotle, the political life defines humans. The humans are the political animal, the zoon politikon. He also defines the human as the animal with speech, so the zoon logon ekon. So unlike stones, we are moved by speech and we speak. We sway others. Now remember, this is something Coriolanus disdains. He disdains speaking and the art of speaking as opposed to mere action. So in this way, he can't fully participate in political life and be human, so to speak. So he also tries to live outside its standards. He questions the standards of the community in terms of how um, um, they they nominate individuals for consul. He's a traitorous innovator for this questioning of that custom. He tries to stand outside their standards in that way. He also asserts that he stands alone. I found I did kind of this word search using the Open Shakespeare Concordance, and it other than what is it, Romeo and Juliet, the word alone appears most frequently in Coriolanus, 12 times and 16 times in Romeo and Juliet. So the second most occurrences of the word alone. So he stresses that he's alone, I did it. So he talks about his battle at Coriolis. Um, and he understands that he wants to achieve his independence and asserts that he's stands as if a man were author of himself and knew no other kin. So he emphasizes this notion that he is an author of himself, and tries to assert his kind of autarkic or independent character in that way. He his blind spot is obviously that he belongs to a larger whole of the family line, that he can't separate himself from the community or his enemies upon which he depends. Like his whole value system is about honor, is about being a great warrior. That depends on others. He's not going to get honor without the members of the community bestowing honor upon him. He's not going to have the virtues of a warrior without an enemy to fight. So he's entirely dependent on others, but cannot see it. I'm going to skip this section on the city and the gods. There's obvious points there in terms of to what extent Shakespeare highlights the fact that the city's religion is a civic religion used to advance cohesion and not necessarily a religion based on a revealed intentions of the divine or faith in some sort of deity. It's more it has a political function of keeping order, so to speak. So we can see that in play as well. Now, some conclusions if we were to wrap up. I'd say in terms of the question of Rome, and remember questions of history and turning to Rome. So the Renaissance is turning to Rome and Shakespeare's turning to Rome for political lessons. How can we live and build a great republic as the Romans did, a great long-lasting political regime with such a long-standing achievements in terms of its peace that it instituted, its conquests, its social order. It's not necessarily the as we've said, it's not necessarily the Rome we see in Shakespeare. Shakespeare kind of wants to poke a hole in that image of Rome. So figures such as Machiavelli wanted to bring back Romans as an ideal of life full of the desire for worldly glory. So he wanted us to see the Romans as an ideal in the face of, or he's, on the cusp of modernity after 1500 years of Christian worldview that saw worldly achievement as secondary to our spiritual home. If for Machiavelli, we're only going to produce these kinds of great institutions, these great cities, if we, like Romans, see worldly achievement as noble. I think Shakespeare um, takes many things from Machiavelli, but not this point. Like, I think for Shakespeare, he sees the world of Rome as somehow claustrophobic, because for a Coriolanus, for many of these characters, there is only worldly achievement, and it comes up as hollow, and there's nothing beyond the city. And we, as I said, we're pointed to in the plays to the tragedy of the city. We're pointed to the fact that it can never fulfill the highest aspects of human longing. Shakespeare, I think, and I'll just highlight this bullet here, Shakespeare, like Nietzsche, sees that Christianity and the spiritual dimensions of humanity that it deepened has deepened the soul of humanity. It has given a certain depth to humanity. And so more specifically, so that's Rome generally, but more specifically on classical republican regime. Some people felt, as I said, can we take lessons from the Romans, or in particular, can we take lessons from republicanism and apply them to the Jacobean context in England? Um, I think Shakespeare felt that England could be inspired by some of the inclusive elements of classical republicanism. However, Shakespeare also believed there needed to be clear roles and a hierarchical order or degree in political structures. So um, there's a famous speech from Ulysses, and I think Shakespeare largely held to this. I think, this speech could be read in the context of a certain irony within the context of the play. However, I think generally speaking, Shakespeare held that this is largely true. So this is Ulysses in Troilus and Cressida, another of Shakespeare's plays. How could communities, degrees in schools, and brotherhoods in cities, peaceful commerce from dividable shores, the primogenity of due of birth, prerogative of age, crowns, scepters, laurels, but by degree stand in authentic place? Take but degree away, untune that string, and hark what discord follows. Each thing meets in mere oppugnancy. So the other point would be that, in contrast, distinction to classical republicanism, we can't have this community that is identical in its interest and united by a common good. They will have an infinite variety of private interests, and that's not a bad thing. Human human diversity in terms of its interests and the different types of individuals is what makes humanity great. And we have to think of a way of having a community bound together of these individual types. After Shakespeare, we would have modern liberal republics that are united in, let us say, letting leash these individual desires, right? Individual choices for what you want to own or what you want to buy and what you want to aspire to. All of those become, uh, let's say, let loose in liberal republics, where the liberal is the operative word in the sense of the freedom of choice and expression is what unites people in the republic. People are not united by the ends that they want to achieve. People are united in that they all recognize the means as important: money, fame, whatever. This was a little after Shakespeare, but Shakespeare recognized that that was, let's say, bringing together individuals and their individual wills is an important, um, say, goal for political life. I think Shakespeare does follow Machiavelli in seeing that there's limits to the applicability of classical Republican principles in terms of the limits of human virtue. So, just as Machiavelli felt, there's we had to kind of update classical republicanism by taking into account how humans really are. We had to take into account that they're selfish and kind of modify our expectations accordingly. So too Shakespeare felt that, and that there are limits of human virtue. And we see in the play, for instance, in both the English and the Roman histories, all the classes are working for their own just interests. Individuals and classes are working for their own interests, never for a common higher purpose. Um, I think the and I think we see this, the other parallel we see this in, and we just mentioned this, is the private ultimately trumping the public interest in Coriolanus, in Act 5, Scene 3, and 3, Scene 2 being the central scenes. Um, I think we see this notion of political spirit in tension with the philosophical quest for wisdom in the histories, but also in these Roman plays and in Coriolanus in particular. He can't find a world elsewhere. He can't transcend the domain of the political to a higher truth. Um, and I think Shakespeare's plays kind of point to the fact that we have to open up a sphere for a higher eros, a higher philosophical eros. I think, like Chaucer, he sees a spiritual need in the individual that's not fully satisfied by political life. Um, and I think, getting back to this point of the tragedy of the whole, um, he, I think he would say that, and this is building on the work of Leo Strauss a little, humanity's highest longing is an apprehension of the whole. What is it all about? What's the cosmos about? Um, let's say the most fundamental question. And how does our life fit into that whole? So that seems to be a knowledge that's not available to us. People can have shortcuts, whether it's revealed religion or just kind of take a belief and run with it, but it's not a knowledge that's available to us in any kind of rational way. So we turn to smaller wholes. We turn to the community, for instance, the political community, and this, I think, is Aristotle's main point, that it's the primary way in which humans make a whole. Um, what we see in the play is the whole, the body politic, in disintegration. And I think Shakespeare, like the classics, like Plato and like Leo Strauss, would say that there's a heterogeneity to the whole, even this whole, the community, just as there is with the larger cosmos. A heterogeneity, which means that we can't fully know it, belong to it, understand it, control it. Part of the tragedy of the whole, or the tragedy of the political in the play, is that the superior is dependent on the inferior and vice versa. So the inside is dependent on the outside, the civilized on the barbarian, the patrician on the plebeian, the performer on the audience, the man on the woman, and in the opposite direction. There's this dependence, but the tragedy is that both sides don't see it. So the plebeians don't see that they need Coriolanus. Coriolanus doesn't see that he needs the plebeians. Um, and as I said, the tragedy of Rome is really the tragedy of the political writ large. Can the political arrangement satisfy our highest human longing? And we do want to belong to that larger whole, but infinite variety means we can never have common ends. And this political whole is confining; it can't satisfy those higher ends. Um, And I think this is where, uh, to return to what was called in the ancients, with Plato and Aristotle, the quarrel of philosophy and poetry. I think this is for Shakespeare where the literary art comes in, or his poetic dramatic art comes in. Starting way back with Aristotle and his poetics, the function of poetry would be to bring forth actions which are disparate and not united, and bring them forth as larger wholes in a way that philosophy and political history cannot. Okay. So Shakespeare, as a dramatist and poet, seems to want to compete with and surpass the attempts of the great philosophers and the historians in articulating truths about political and human experience by bringing them together into wholes through the dramatic narrative. And we can see this in the kind of the progress of the genres. Remember, we talked about Shakespeare's genres when we introduced his drama, and we begin with the kind of the comedies and how they're really about Eros, and Eros needing to be channeled into the community or the political realm. And we have Henriade and the histories, the English histories, um, where we have, let's say, the unfolding of the political drama, and that political drama ends up pointing to, let's say, the tragedy of the political that we see in the Roman plays, and then tragedy writ large in the other tragedies, Othello, King Lear, Macbeth, where not just the tragedy of the political is on display, but the tragedy of the individual confronting the cosmos. And then finally, the with the romances, the last plays he wrote, we have plays that could be tragic, but they're saved in the last instance, largely through poetic, or this is why they're called romance tales, fanciful, miraculous interventions by, in the case of Prospero, a magician who is a figure for Shakespeare as poet himself. So, with that conclusion, I'll wrap up our discussion of Coriolanus. I hope you enjoyed the play, and I hope you enjoyed these thoughts on it, and Shakespeare's, I think, say, critique of classical Roman ideal, the classical Republican ideal, the need to account for the infinite variety of humans, pointing to the, say, the tragedy of the political because it can't satisfy our human longings, and in the end, pointing to the role of the poet dramatist in maybe creating wholes for us. So thank you very much.